So welcome and thank you all, and especially our guests for coming out on a snowy, slippery evening. So I'm Jose Alvarez, and David Malone, my co-teacher in the class on law and practice, law actually and diplomacy of the international organizations, will be presenting our guests. But let me just say a few words about David, although I suspect that some of you already know. He's a long-standing visitor to the law school. He's taught here for quite some time. And incidentally, those of you who think you might become diplomats or anything involving international organizations, he'll be having a little career talk on February 19th from 1 to 2. Free sandwiches are provided, but no guarantee there won't be snow for that. We are told that event is going to be in Vanderbilt 214, but keep an eye out in case that changes. So just a little bit about David Malone. He's the Undersecretary General of the UN. He's rector of the UN University. He's from Canada, but don't hold that against him. He was Canada's International Development Research Center from 2008 to 2013. He's been High Commissioner from Canada to India, non-resident ambassador to Bhutan and Nepal from 2004 to 2006. He served as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Global Issues at the Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And he's been, before that, President of the International Peace Academy, now known as the International Peace Institute. He has written a ton of books, including the case book that we use, and some of you are there from that class, in international organizations, which just presents one irritating question after another that are used for class discussion. It's called Law and Practice of the UN. But he's also written books on Nepal in transition and does the elephant dance, contemporary Indian foreign policy. And it's thanks to his effort that we have our distinguished guest today. So take it away.
Great, Jose. Thank you very much. Great to have you all here. It's obviously a horrible evening to be out and about, and we're very grateful to Fang for struggling. She's up in Tarrytown attending a conference. She had to struggle all her way into New York, so we're pathetically grateful. Now, I think some of you have seen elements of her life story professionally. She was a law student in China at the University of Wuhan. She got PhD in law at a time when there weren't that many PhD in law programs. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, many of you may know. She also studied at the University of Leiden, where she studied, I think, space and aviation law. And she joined China's civil administration. So she didn't take the academic route. She went to China's Civil Aviation Administration, which must be a huge enterprise, given the size of the country and how many people fly around China. And her career was in it largely until she became Director General of Administration and Services of ICAO in Montreal, the International Civil Aviation Organization. A tough gig. Managing any UN organization is extremely tough because UN types are anarchists when it comes to their own interests, and so very hard to manage. But all proceeded well. Indeed, the administration of ICAO improved hugely during her period as Director General and that of her predecessor, a French gentleman, while you were director, you were directing administration. So that's her career to date. She's still young, so we wonder what she'll do next, but we're very proud to have her here, and we'll make sure we leave lots of time for your questions. So I did want to ask you about, and then I'm going to turn you over to Jose. You clearly had civil aviation in mind all along, and I wanted to ask you why. What was it about civil aviation that appealed to you so much?
Thank you, David. And I'm delighted to hear, and I'll be honored to be invited to have this conversation with the students. because I see you and give me some sort of memories when I was a student in law school. It's a very good question. Why I selected aviation as my career? So if I could ask you a question, who ever knows how many passengers, air passengers, carried out globally last year? How many flights per day operated globally? So let me answer the question. It's 4.1 billion passengers last year and carried out by 100,000 daily flights supported by our global system. And what is going to see in 15 years? Traffic volume will be doubling. That means 200,000 daily flights. And by 2030, and will be supported by our global system. Then you can see how important the regulatory framework it is for the global system. And I believe every one of you take flights. Otherwise, I believe you cannot be here, and in particular for the international students. So that's the importance I see for a lawyer working for the aviation, and also the potential for the young generation to joining civil aviation sector. No matter you're working in the government, in the airlines, in the airport, in the air navigation service providers, in academia, in the international organization like ICAO. So it has great potential for the young people to take on the job. Not only nowadays for the manned aircraft you see now, but in the very near future, you can see unmanned aircraft will be flying, like flying taxi, and also drones, right? It will be joining our aviation community, and in maybe 5 to 10 years, and even quicker if our regulatory framework is ready for these operations. So I see that is a very promising industry and also sector. That's why I think I'm delighted to have this conversation with the young generation.
Terrific, Fang. I'm going to turn you over to Jose now, who will probably ask you questions relating to the legal dimension of our topic.
Yeah, I guess. So you mentioned the regulatory framework, and one of the things that's striking about ICAO is that before ICAO was around, there were a number of treaties, and they were typical treaties with hard obligations. Then ICAO comes around, and you have standards and recommended practices, which nobody's quite sure whether you are bound by a standard or whether they're all soft law. And in fact, all that the convention says is you're supposed to just report whether you're in compliance or not. And so how does that work in your view? That is, it seems to be relatively effective, and yet it's soft law. Very few disputes arise, at least within the organization, that are before an adjudicative body. And the SARPs are sometimes incorporated into national law. But explain a little bit why, as opposed to many other forms of international law, yours seems to be effective.
That's very true. Before I answer your question, I would like to just briefly introduce what is ICAO. I believe, I think maybe everyone already knows ICAO, but refresh your memories. So ICAO was established actually by the Convention on International Civil Aviation, which was signed on 7th December 1944, before Second World War end. Actually, at the time, the UN Charter was also developed at that time in California. So the convention was signed in Chicago, so-called Chicago Convention, so you know very well Chicago Convention. So that is ICAO's constitution. So under that convention, it's very clear we have the assembly, and it will be held once every 3 years. And then we have the governing body council, we call it council. Now it is composed by 36 member states elected at the assembly. And the council adopted, only council, let me emphasize, adopted standards and the recommended practice, like just mentioned, soft regulation. And then we also have, under council, there is a navigation commission that is a technical body to review and develop all the subs supported by the secretariat. I'm working secretariat, I'm the head of the secretariat. So to develop these standards, nowadays we have over 12,000 standards. And this designed as annexes to the Chicago Convention, even though these annexes are not integrated part of the convention, but is annexed to the convention. Now we have 19 annexes to the convention. So these annexes set up the technical specifications for all the operations of civil aviation. I just indicated these flights I just mentioned, supported by our global system. So you can notice when you fly, no matter Air France or Delta or Americans or India Airlines or Air China, you see more or less uniformity in terms of pilots, in terms of air hostess, and in terms of operations. That is because we have these 19 annexes set up these technical specifications from the operation of air, from the routes, from the procedures, and from the aircraft and airworthiness and the license. So all this are set by these standards. And what is effect of the standards? And I should say first, the standards is one of the speciality of ICAO because that help our member states and to establish its national regulations and then to support national operations as well as international operations. So what are the effects of these standards? Conventionally, legal binding. So as I said, you have standards and recommended practices. That's called the SOPs. SOPs. So standards, that means that is the specification, the uniform application of these standards is recognized as necessary for the safety and also the regularity of the air navigation services. That is called the standards. Then what is recommended practices? The recommended practice means that the specification, uniform application is recognized as desirable for the interest of safety and regularity of operation of the services. So you can see that is under the Chicago Convention, which empowers our governing body to adopt the standards and also regularly update these standards, and along with the technology advancement and also the circumstance changed. And then under the Chicago Convention, there is another article, Article 38, you probably already see. The member states can file difference if it deemed these standards are not is impracticable. So they can file these differences to our governing body council, then these standards will not apply. However, this impracticability is not just to say that, okay, many states just file the difference. Because as I said, standards are very clear for the uniform application. And when states are party of the Chicago Convention, we have now 192 member states, little less of United Nations membership. But with the states party of the Chicago Convention, so the states, if they are national law or have any specific challenges to fully implement the standards, then they can file differences. That's for the standards. as I said, the recommended practice that is not mandatory, is desirable. But because the uniform application of the standards and recommended practices is in the interest of a global community. So that's why the states will try their best to also comply with the recommended practice, and if their national circumstances allow them to do that. So nowadays you see that aviation is one of the most standardized sector in the world. So that's also because of these standards and the build-up, the uniformity application of the technical specifications for the operations.
So what's the relationship between the organization and private airlines, right? I mean, that's most of commercial airlines, certainly in the West. So how would you describe the relationship?
ICAO has a relationship for time being through its the industry association. Like airlines have IATA, you probably hear, is Airlines Association. And airports has ACI, is Airport International, okay? And then you have air navigation service providers. Probably you do not see it, but and certainly you are amazed to see how important are the air navigation service, because all the aircraft navigated, directed by air navigation services, and to through the which routes, which you should, and going down, which you should take off. Without air navigation services, you are not able to do it. You probably see in the airport tower. You see, right? That is air navigation service. That's just for the approaching and the landing. But you also have the on-road when your aircraft fly over the high seas. Then there is also air navigation services. And then we also have air pilots associations and all kind of labor associations. What ICAO's interaction with these private activities and commercial activities, I should emphasize ICAO's role. As you know, as your passenger, you know, if there is anything happen, there is liability of the airlines. How it will happen this way? Because ICAO, we developed a so-called liability system that is a private international law. That is a very unique. We developed the private international law as provisions, not only the private international law to for the let's choose which law jurisdiction. Okay, for the private international law, and starting from 1929 is what we call the Warsaw Convention. Warsaw Convention established liability for the air of the passenger, okay, and also cargo. And then over the years, in 1999, the global community modernized these provisions. So agreed to sign a convention we call the Montreal Convention, that is also for the carriage by air, covering passenger liability and cargo liability. And also one of the important elements is modernization of the process and procedure. So after 1999, you now have an electronic ticket, right? So that is because that convention provided the opportunity and also legal basis for the global airlines issuing electronic tickets. And now, unfortunately, air cargo still, I mean, the cargo airway bills, still not universally accepted with the electronic airway bill. So that is my efforts. I would like to see that there is electronic airway bills could be accepted by the global airlines. That is, I'm now working on that, because you imagine air cargo is one of the fastest, let's say, transportation means, but other transportation means like road, like sea transportation, they already use electronic airway bills. So, and for the intermodal transportation, and also in particular for facilitating trade and to speed up the investment turnover, it's extremely important if we can have electronic airmobiles. And so that is for the liability part, as I mentioned, the interaction with airlines. There is another element is also very important, you probably also know. We have a Capitan Convention, that is the asset transfer from the different entities in order for the this kind of high value asset can be can be transactioned and to promote this transaction for the for the operations of our industry. That I'm talking about the aircraft. Okay, so because of this kind of legal framework, I believe it's also make our airlines and also airports, all these commercial entities be able to operate. There is another important element I want to also indicate it. ICAO, from the Chicago Convention, you know, is a standard setting organization. But over the years, at the later 1990s, we introduced mandatory auditing system. So we have, this is unique in the UN system. So we have an auditing system. We audit member states' implementation of our standards in the safety and the security area. So what that means, then when the standards are established and member states accept to implement, we will audit whether these standards reflected into the member states' national regulations, in order to ensure the member states have the solid national oversight system and the regulatory framework. And of course, this will request lots of resources and also efforts from both from our member states and also from industry. And then because ICAO's audit mandatory programs, IATA established also mandatory audit program to the airlines. And of course, you can see the airlines know their safety record improved over the years. That is also one of the phenomena I should emphasize. And the airport, we also now cooperate with the airport in order to ensure the airport also have a similar this audit mechanism. Now still at the voluntary basis, I think in future should have also this kind of audit mechanism for the airports in the operations and also in the security areas. As you know, when you go through the security, you see the different security process and procedure, and in order to ensure you are safe, safely arrive the final destination, you would take the aircraft. So that is what I see the interactions with the private sector. And obviously, the standard setting process will also involve our private sector. They, for time being, they are as the observers of these associations, as I mentioned, IATA, ACI, and the Council, and to participate in our standard setting process. And as well, some private sector like Boeing, Airbus, they also be observer as like a state observer to be part of a US delegation or part of like France or let's say Germany, because the European Union is not our members, so they cannot be our let's say experts to be part of our process. But they can be also participate our meetings at our governing bodies meetings as an observer.
So I guess I wish that the security systems were even more uniform so that they make up their minds whether I have to take my shoes off. And what about those laptops? I mean, those kinds of issues. But I guess the other question that comes up is I think what you described is not just a safety organization, it's a counterterrorism organization. You're the place where a lot of counterterrorism treaties were negotiated. You're also a place that a lot of states turn to for development. That is, if you don't have an airline, you don't develop. So you're a development organization like many UN bodies. And there's aspects in your website that suggest you do environmental issues, you protect global health and the Ebola crisis. So it's a lot of stuff coming onto your plate. So how do lawyers interact with such a diversity of issues? And I guess one of the questions is, you could say something about what is the strength of this technocratic organization to do all those things relative to the WTO or to the WHO or to other UN system organizations. What's the strength of ICAO?
So I believe ICAO as UN specialized agency is a good example of the cooperation of member states. And also ICAO delivers the results to the benefits of the member states and the general public. I think through my previous, remarks, you can already see what our values for the general public and also for the member states. I cannot see without ICAO, without our leadership, so the global regulatory framework could be such effectively established. And also I cannot see the general public can reach safely and securely to your final destination through air transport. Like you said, air transport, and I will see, is one of the essential driver of economic development. As I just mentioned, 100,000 daily flights per day. Imagine this 100,000 daily flights stopped one day. What will be look like the world? You probably still remember then some years ago in Europe, because volcanic ash disrupted Europeans' operations, and then how much impact to the business, to the ordinary your activities, not talking about economic loss. And then for the security as well, you see when the Brussels airports and Istanbul airports were unfortunately attacked by the terrorism, and how much disruptive to national and international activities and business and all normal life, public's life. So I see that is what UN organization as like ICAO we deliver. We ensure this part of the business and also activities is well oversight and also operated according to the norms which agreed upon by the member states through the cooperation. So our standard process are normally around 4 years. So starting from member states or experts and or ICAO, we initiate the new standards or let's say updating, existing standards, and then we develop these standards through the working groups, which composed by our member states and all the industry experts, and through also our panel, we call the panel, and which obviously by the our member states as well as experts and also the industry observers, and supported by our secretariat. And once there is this kind of draft preliminary standards, we send to the states for comments, for their inputs. Then after we receive comments and inputs, we finalize these standards through internal process, as I said, the Air Navigation Commission and the Governing Body Council, and then we promulgate it in these standards. So through this process, I believe, which engage member states, engage industry, and see there is necessity to establish standards which in the benefits of the operation of the sector. And then by these standards to ensure our safe and secure operation. Like you said, unfortunately, aviation is a target and a choice by the terrorism. And then that's back 1960s. So we have in ICAO, we have 24 international legal instruments. But most of them, I would say, lots of them, I would say not most, lots of them related to the aviation security area. And you have 1963 Tokyo Convention, you have 1971 like Montreal Convention, and then you have also recently 2010 Beijing Convention, Beijing Protocol, and also 1971 Montreal Convention and the Protocol. So all this set up like a legal framework to address the unlawful interference to civil aviation, no matter onboard aircraft, no matter the target aircraft in service or aircraft in flight, and no matter airports or air navigation service provide services facilities. So then it's established legal jurisdictions for member states to criminalize this offense and also of these activities which damage and harm of international civil aviation operation. So I would see these legal frameworks are really effective, and also I would say it's a successful story for the international legal instruments. We got most of the countries ratified these conventions. So now we are promoting 2010 Beijing Convention and the Protocol, because in these conventions also there is a component to tackle the cyber threats to the air navigation and facilities and for the airports as well. So because you know nowadays cyber attacks and threats are really new phenomenon, and which will be impact every area. But aviation again, because new technology becoming more and more advanced in the aviation sector, then cyber attack, cyber issue, and really is one of the top our priority, I can tell you, and for the, our international standards.
So I'll turn you to the students in a minute, so be prepared for your questions. But I guess that leads to, so you're a lawyer, you work with lawyers all the time. What set of skills is a good lawyer to you, and what is a good lawyer?
Very good question. I can only say for myself. I believe to be a good lawyer, should know what the subject matter. And I think I see me as a lawyer passionate for the aviation. So that's why I'm aviation law. Okay, aviation lawyer. And the reason I say that, and it's from my career, you probably already, David already introduced. I started my career in the Civil Aviation Authority of China as a lawyer, and I got good opportunity at the time. I participated in the development of China's civil aviation law. This gave me the golden opportunity to understand whole areas and activities of civil aviation. So I did it for 2 to 3 years. So that gave me really the first hands of experience in dealing with different parts of the civil aviation. Then, and I switched to, I did not mention that part yet, I switched to the air navigation, air services agreements negotiations. That is another international public law in the civil aviation. As you know, in the Chicago Convention, I talk about a lot technical, standards, right? But I did not talk about economic with any framework under the Chicago Convention. But as you know, after the end Second World War, during the Chicago Convention's diplomatic conference, there are two groups of states at the time to discuss, negotiate this Chicago Convention. One group that is led by United States. Another group is led by UK. So the time United States promoted liberalization of airspace. And then the UK won't have the regulation of airspace. So what you see now, airlines flight, right? The frequencies. How many frequencies? Between New York to Beijing, between New York to Tokyo. This was regulated by 100,000 bilateral air services agreements. The reason now governed by bilateral agreements is because during the Chicago Convention's diplomatic conference, these two groups could not have agreements. And then for Chicago Convention, if you look at Article 5, Article 6, and Article 7, Article 5 talking about non-scheduled services. That means like charter services, okay? And Article 6 is talking about the scheduled services. That means you have weekly services. You see it's scheduled, it's in the timetable, okay? And for this scheduled service now governed by this bilateral agreement, and which clearly indicates in the Chicago Convention Article 6, and it is said this leave to be regulated by member states through themselves. Then Article 7 is very important, cabotage. So that's why you see domestic air services only operated by its domestic airlines. You do not see in the United States British Airways operate services, right? You never see. That is also Chicago Convention determined. So then, back to my point. After my work for the developing China's civil aviation law, so I switched to the negotiation for the bilateral air services agreements. So that is exchange traffic rights, and to establish this framework for the airlines to operate, but through the government agreements. So how many frequencies, how many points exchange between any given states, negotiated by them. But nowadays, you also can see, like United States, since 1970s, they started the deregulation of their domestic air transport, and then in the international area, they push for the open skies agreements. What means open skies agreement? That means, back to the 1944, as I indicated, U.S. would like to liberalization of airspace. So liberalize the market access of the international air transport. So what it means, air service agreement is the market access for international air transport. So open skies, that means, let's say, free trade of air transport market. So now, lots of states now have this kind of open skies agreements bilaterally with the United States or with some other states, but still there's numbers of the member states and have this agreements, but it's not open skies agreement, still setting up how many frequencies per week, how many points in each country can exchange, and what kind of conditions for operations. So this economic market access conditions now governed by this bilateral agreement. Then for the environment issue, and also SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, you mentioned. I see the aviation, as just mentioned, is really is a strong economic driver. And as indicated, 100,000 daily flights, what is economic impact? I just give you one number. For the air transport, the air cargo only represents 0.5% of global trade volume. However, it represents 35% of, in terms of value, of the global trade. So that means air transport carried out 35% of the value of global trade every year. And then, if we're talking about, we all know tourism is one of the big, or I don't want to say strongest driver for the economic development. And then I just mentioned 4.1 billion passenger, right? For all the passenger. For the travelers is about 50% of global tourism carried out by air. So then for the small island states, landlocked states, and this number going up to 80%, 90%, or 98%. So for these states, actually air transport is a lifeline for them to link with their states with the rest of the world. And also is a lifeline for their economic development and economic activities. So that's why ICAO is actively participating the United Nations Visionary Agenda, 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, and we believe we can contribute tremendously to the member states and through their efforts to make aviation as one of the priority sector to invest, and also to invest not only for the infrastructure but human capacity, and because we need people to manage all these kind of activities. And
I think we need to get to the students, actually.
But I promise they won't bring their resumes or anything.
And I'm going to get you a glass of water. I'm sorry, we haven't thought of that.
Oh, there's water
Oh, there is?
right behind us. Yes.
Great.
So, yes, proceed.
So thank you so much for coming and explaining to us about ICAO and how it works. I was just wondering if I don't know if ICAO regulates also TSA, but I understand the reason why ICAO works so well is because it focuses on technicalities, technical standards, and economic standards. But what about when certain TSA, like how can ICAO work against discrimination against people of color or people with a certain name when they're on no-fly list or something? It seems more of like an annoyance, but at the same time it also shows that people of color and brown people will not be treated the same as other people when they go on flights. So I was just wondering, does ICAO work on that? And if not, how can it work on removing discrimination for the sake of counterterrorism policies?
Great question.
And an excellent question. And of course, discrimination is not a choice. And actually, all our standards are the anti-discrimination and applying to everybody. And TSA, United States, okay, and is one of our most important partner. And not only is our biggest contributor, but also I think U.S. is one of the biggest aviation country in all counts. Okay, so TSA contribute a lot to our standards, international standards in the aviation security areas. I believe the standards should not discriminatory, and it's a matter as how to train the people to implement these standards. This is ongoing efforts. And I believe United States and also make these efforts because, as you know, after 9/11, this security phenomenon becoming one of our priority. And almost now we want to make a par to the safety. Okay, and one of the important element, I think probably you also can agree with me, safety is becoming culture for the aviation, but security is not yet. And this needs also everyone, not only the industry, but also the public, the clients, also can have this kind of security culture when you go to the airport, when you go on board of aircraft. So this is what we want to make efforts together with our member states and industry and also public to build security culture in the aviation sector, because it's extremely important, as I indicated. Unfortunately, aviation is targeted by the terrorism. So we need to ensure we make measures, and this measure is appropriate, is not over, and because we do not want to hinder facilitation, because we want the people, smoothly go through the airport. And imagine, as I indicated, by 2030, our traffic volume will be doubling. If we do not make our passengers smoothly go through the airports, how many passengers will be waiting in front of the security checking points? And also, I do not think our airport will be able to afford to that. So that's why we also promote like new technology, and which will facilitate and make our passengers and feel user-friendly. And when you go through the airport, security check.
You had your hand up before.
So one of the most interesting stories to me about civil aviation in the last few months is the resumption of flights between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and how that sort of facilitated goodwill between the two after 20 years of war. People visiting their families all of a sudden. ICAO is involved in all these different sectors: health, environment, security. How do you see its sort of involvement in perhaps facilitating peace agreements, sort of that can move people towards goodwill, like what's happening over there in East Africa?
That's also a very good question. As I indicated, aviation is a connectivity, and make people to understand better. And what I see an ICAO's contribution and for the areas which under, let's say, this kind of conflict, okay? Well, first of all, we ensure still there is operation, ongoing, and in order allowing people can get in and get out. And that also will provide assistance to the United Nations organizations like WFP, UNHCR, and other, peacekeeping operations to ensure they are able to go to carry out their tasks and to help the states to address these elements as issue. And as also aviation is also involve airspace. Airspace is, according to the international principle, is sovereignty. And but we want also ensure the operation above the territory and the airspace can be supported safely and securely. So we help the states and in particular civil aviation authorities and to have appropriate mechanism and to operate and to support these kind of operations.
Yes.
So, if you are saying that air traffic is going to double by 2030, what kind of regulatory framework do we need now to offset the environmental impact of that?
Good, very good question.
Yeah, great question.
Yes. Of course, we only have one planet. Everyone would like preserve it, to allowing our next generations can enjoy and also can live in this planet. And aviation sector, we take that responsibility very seriously. As you know, Paris Agreement, but Paris Agreement doesn't touch upon the international civil aviation's emissions. As you know, for the whole aviation emission, we represent around 2% of whole emission, 2%. With regard to international civil aviation's emission, is about 1.3%. So for the other part, I mean, the emissions, which will be under the national regime, under the Paris Agreement, I'm talking about 1.3%. That is for the international civil aviation emission. And over the years, ICAO took leadership to address this issue in order to fill the gap. Then in the last assembly, as I said, we have once every 3 years. In 2016, October 2016, our member states adopted a so-called CO2 emissions offsetting and reduction regime for the international civil aviation. We say the CORSIA. So after this CORSIA established, last June, our governing body, and with Secretariat's efforts, we supported to establish this kind of standards and the international standards for implementing CORSIA. So now we are now working on to assist our member states to establish national regulations to introduce this international standards on CORSIA in their national system. So what I'm saying, that for the CORSIA, we have a voluntary stage. We have a first phase and a second phase. So we hope with all these efforts, our member states will take on this 1.3% of for time being the emissions and to seriously repeat the other ways as a last resort. Last resort. What I'm saying last resort, because we encourage our member states to have established state action plan to address environmental issue. This state action plan include technology advancement, operation procedure improvements, and then CORSIA, then alternative fuels. And with these efforts, we hope the states can reduce the emissions, and we also set 2020 as emission neutral target. And in order, with the increase of traffic volume, not increase at the same time emissions. So that is our efforts. I believe with technological advancement, as you know, just to give you an example, 50 years ago, our aircraft is much noisy. And nowadays, almost 75% quieter than the first commercial aircraft in operation. So I'm confident with the technology advancement, the emission from the air transport sector will be reduced. However, I still think that we should have a mechanism to offset, if the emission cannot maintain at the level we expect. So the member states can take the actions and the measures to address this issue.
Yes, over here.
This was alluded to in some of the other questions, but more broadly, within the legal framework of the conventions, how do you toe the line between politics and policy? And to give a specific example, the most uncontroversial mission of ICAO was, air travel safety, but that became a huge political issue in the United States just recently when essentially the TSA shut down for a period of time. And how do you manage that sort of situation where you need to put pressure on members, but also you have a technocratic focus and balance those two things within kind of the legal framework that you're doing?
It's also a very good question. And nowadays, we cannot live in the society without politics, right? It's impossible. But ICAO's primary objective is to ensure safety and security of operation of our global aviation system. So when there is this kind of, vulnerabilities in certain parts of the world, and ICAO will always approach the member states and to assist them to address the issue, to ensure there is a sufficient mechanism and also the framework in place to ensure public safety when you take on board aircraft.
Yes, right here.
So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about this Brexit, this uncertainty around the Brexit, and how do you feel this will impact aviation?
We see it's impacting the airlines involved a great deal. So good question.
That's a very good question. Of course, Brexit is one of the issue we are monitoring very closely. And as a matter of fact, I just had a co-conversation with the Director General of UK Civil Aviation Authorities yesterday to see what kind of situation or what kind of mechanism and also what ICAO can help. As far as I know there is a mechanism I think in place for UK and if Brexit without agreement, okay, hard Brexit. That means UK will allow the existing EASA, that is European Civil Aviation Agencies, regulations still valid for a period of time, at least I think for UK side they say that for 2 years, for EASA side it's for 9 months, and then depending what kind of agreement it will be. And then after the Brexit, I believe there is should have negotiations, and depending what kind of Brexit, as I said, will be happening. And in order for the both sides to establish proper mechanism to see what is the UK's regulations and what is the EASA regulation. But as I said, ICAO's standards is the basis for all the member states, including UK. So the UK now is our member states, and they are committed to comply with ICAO standards. So that's why you see from that part, it's from the technical regulatory framework is in place even after Brexit. And for the commercial, we mentioned this commercial arrangements, I think is subject to individual states to negotiate. As indicated, ICAO's role for the economic regulations is limited. And even though we only provide guidance, materials, and also the policy direction, but there is no mandatory power to the member states. And for this kind of market access agreement, subject to the individual states to negotiate. And but as far as I know, UK government has various negotiations with its counterparts in order to ensure the continuity of the operation after Brexit.
Way in the back. Eric.
On earlier. So since ICAO's strategic objectives like environmental sustainability, economic development, and security overlap with the missions of some other UN organizations and agencies, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about how ICAO goes about collaborating with other UN organizations and how when disagreements happen, where ICAO's approach to an issue might differ from another UN organization's approach, how disagreements are resolved.
And very good question. For time being, I see ICAO's mandate, standard setting mandate, does not overlap with any other UN organization. I believe that is the ICAO's core mandate provided by the member states. However, there is for sure, there is plenty of areas for the cooperation among the United Nations organization. For just one example, Josie just mentioned about health issue, okay, Ebola. As you know, air transport somehow is the channel to disseminate this kind of disease. So we have close cooperation with WHO and also other related organizations to establish proper mechanism. And of course, standard setting still is ICAO's role, but we listen and take the comments and inputs from other organizations. And also, like WHO also have this kind of standard setting roles, and to ensure their standards are also consistent or harmonized with ICAO standards. So that, I think, we are doing very well. And another example, like security. As you know, United Nations Security Council has a very important role to play for dealing with terrorism. And as you know, recently, UN Security Council adopted several resolutions. One is in 2016 dedicated to aviation security. And also in 2017, they also adopted another resolution, 2396, which is mandatory, has mandatory nature, as you all know, Chapter 7 of UN Charter. And so that also requested member states to implement ICAO standards. And also they established wanted to have PNR standards, like passenger name record standards. So ICAO now, we are in the process to speed up to establish standards. In addition, ICAO has standards, so-called Advanced Passenger Information, API. And so that is already in our standards. So for the United Nations Security Council, with their resolution, actually, they call on all the member states to implement ICAO standards. I believe with UN Security Council resolution, also give ICAO standards another inputs, and also at the state level, and for the member states to implement our standards.
Yes. So I'm curious about some of the open skies agreements you were talking about before. There's a lot of tension right now with the big three U.S. airlines trying to keep the Middle Eastern free from expanding inside the U.S. And I was just wondering, with a lot of protectionist political movements like this happening in the world, do you think we're moving towards more open skies or less open skies in terms of freedom of airlines to expand to other countries?
My personal view, I see the liberalization is the trend. And because I think the world need liberalized market access for all the players. However, with the liberalization, you need to have a regulatory regime to ensure the competition is fair. So that is, two sides of the coin. So I believe with the Open Skies Agreement, also need to have a fair competition regime to ensure every player has the opportunity to compete. So what you said, that case is a bit complicated and case, and from different perspectives can see differently. But I believe at the end of the day, it depending to the member states to see what kind of goal and they want to achieve, and what are the benefits they would like to obtain. And from whether you want to have a more strong airlines, or you want to have more passengers, or you want to have more developed airports with more connections with the rest of the world. And my view is, I say it's better to take a balanced approach to ensure the different players has its role to play and to support national interests.
Yes.
So this question builds on your introduction over all those mechanisms in enforcing those standards. So I'm wondering, like, if countries, member states ever has disputes like over whether the country are implementing those standards and like how those disputes are like resolved under ICAO. And I also like learned that there's a dispute resolution mechanism. So I'm wondering like whether like the disputes are more solved through like diplomat or like through more like arbitration or like legal ways.
Also, a very good question. You know, you touched upon ICAO's very unique let's say function is quasi judicial function of our governing body council. As you know, we for time being we have 2 cases now right away in front of our governing body council. In the past, already had a couple of cases dealt with. Okay, some of the cases at the end, the member states withdraw, and some cases is just they had agreement through mediation. So these 2 cases now are for time being in front of our governing body. One is the Qatar, sue raised submit application against 4 states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain, claiming they violate their international obligations under the Chicago Convention. And then another related case, also Qatar against 3 countries that, as I mentioned before, and because Saudi Arabia is not a party to the International Transit Agreement, so they also raised this case claiming the 3 states, Egypt, UAE, and also Bahrain, violate international transit agreement about the flying, overflying their territory. There is another case is Brazil against the United States for there is one operation which caused accident in Brazil. But this case, I think the 2 parties now under the negotiations, and hopefully they can find the solutions. So then back towards to you. Yes, if there is different interpretations, divergent views for the implementation of the Chicago Convention, member states has the right to bring the case to the governing body, and the governing body, our council, should table their request for consideration. But however, as I mentioned, for the quasi-judicial function of our governing body, there is special procedure. And once they submit the case to our governing body, the governing body will make a decision, and then it's appealable. And as I said, that the case, I just mentioned the Qatar case, now the other parties, now because the case council already made a decision that governing body has jurisdiction for this case, but the other 3 states say they appeal to the ICJ and to have the review, and we're waiting for the ICJ's decision.
Well, I think we actually ran out of time, but thank you for that.